I'm Nicola Tallant, and you can listen to my brand new podcast, Beast, The Murder of Nora Sheehan, streaming now, wherever you get your podcasts. Coming back to talk to you again because of all that's happening in Israel and Palestine, Hamas deep underground with what's believed to be this arsenal of weapons and funding, obviously, and Hezbollah sitting on the Lebanese border, everybody watching what they're going to do. The last time we spoke about Hezbollah was in connection with the Kinahans and others who have been using them to money launder a lot of the cocaine cash. So I just thought, jeepers, they're loaded, yeah? Over the last 10, 15 years, they must have a massive amount of cash stored away.
Yeah, it's it's a pretty interesting sort of place in the world where lots of things converge, so they're this sort of, I guess the way I would sort of see it in the simplest terms is that, your listeners will be familiar, with economic sanctions from obviously all of the sanctions have come down onto the Kinahan organization. But, sanctions have often, previously been used against governments, so notably Iran. So Iran, until the Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Iran was the most sanctioned government in the world. And Hezbollah has always been, since its sort of formation in the early 80s, Iran's most important proxy sort of military outfit outside of Iran. So, it was sort of trained and funded by Iran, and it's grown over time into more of a sort of like lots of different things. It's a political movement. It's a terrorist organization. There's been different approaches from different governments about Hezbollah, so the UK and the US and now Germany, they consider the whole of Hezbollah to be a terrorist organization designated as such. Whereas there are other countries that sort of split it into a political wing and a military wing. But Iran has always been under these sanctions, and Hezbollah obviously too has been under sanctions because it's a designated terrorist organization by, most importantly, the United States. So if you are sanctioned, that just very simply means that you can't do business in a normal way. You can't buy things or procure items you need in the way which other governments or organizations do. So it means every time anyone's doing business with you, if they're an American or someone who does business with, the United States, they are breaking the law. So it means that you have to go to different sorts of channels or places or deal with different types of people to procure the things you need. So it creates this kind of part of the kind of black market, the global shadow economy, where these sorts of organizations come into contact with quite unlikely bedfellows. So it could be drugs traffickers in Europe, for example, or it could be, weapons dealers and these people, they don't necessarily have any ideological alignment with the end organization. It's not like they care necessarily about the ideology of the people they're dealing with, but it becomes a sort of pragmatic business relationship where, in the case of drug traffickers, you have a situation where they have a need, like a critical logistical component of being a kind of transnational, drugs trafficking organization is obviously one part is moving the drugs, but another really important part of that is being able to move massive amounts of money around the world. As you know better than me, you have to be able to pay your suppliers. You have to be able to pay your own organization. You have to do lots of things. And that means that they have a need. And there are, in the kind of international criminal economy, there are these service providers, people who, instead of, it's kind of like outsourcing. It's like either you have your own internal money laundering function, which works up to a point. But when you get to very, very large scale, you need to kind of you decide to say, okay, I could do this myself and it gets really complicated and I have to do all of these things. Or I could just find someone who can say, I'll do this for you for 10% or 5%. And so there's this sort of service providers who are providing this critical logistical function. And at the same time, you have governments, sanctioned governments, who for decades have developed a huge expertise in evading sanctions and moving money around the world surreptitiously, specifically in a way where they can't, or try at least not to be, busted by the governments, the Western governments who are trying to stop them doing that. So it's a sort of strange collision between these places. And I think that's sort of the starting point for all of this.
I think there was a report there recently on the Organised Crime and Reporting Project, and they were actually talking about Hezbollah having people specifically living in South America to deal with the cartels there. Like that had gone on for almost well over a decade. Like it is that developed.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You have with these organizations, you sort of like paramilitary terrorist organizations, you have these sort of various degrees of centralization and hierarchy, where sometimes it's difficult to know what is sort of centralized, sort of intentional behavior, and what is sort of side hustles, corruption, people raising funds for strategic purposes or raising funds for basically their own pocket.
You see, you're talking about, I mean, literally we're talking about this all the time, but when we get on to the IRA, similar things happened. There was always accusations that some of them were actually lining their own pockets and weren't giving it to the cause. So you'd have all that going on in the same way.
Yeah, it's a really, really good kind of comparison. I mean, it's sort of like in all of these organizations, they evolve, the people in them evolve, their interests change over time. People kind of go through phases in their life where they're more ideological, less ideological, like motivated by different things. And in the case of, there are different assessments of Hezbollah's sort of role in crime. So the US government, this isn't me saying this. This is like, the US Treasury, when they sanction someone, they use lots of different inputs, including declassified intelligence. And, they've sanctioned very, very senior Hezbollah officials for specifically, among other things, being involved in, transportation of illegal drugs. So in more recent times, we've seen a lot of focus on the Captagon trade, with in Syria, it's a type of sort of amphetamine, synthetic amphetamine, which is being produced en masse by the Syrian regime, but has to be sort of trafficked through Lebanon, and the border. The US government has named repeatedly, senior officials who are involved in this stuff because Hezbollah controls important logistical points in Lebanon. But then the assessments differ depending on who you're talking to. Some people say this is a centralized, process to raise funds, and they draw a historical line. They say after the 2006 war with Israel, when a huge amount of damage is inflicted on Hezbollah and Lebanon, there was this massive rebuilding that needed to be done. At the same time, just after that, in 2008, you had a global economic crash. The price of oil tumbled. Iran was already under sanctions, but obviously it generates a massive amount of money through oil revenues. And but those collapsed at that moment, and they needed to find alternative sources of funding. So that was also sort of, some officials say that was the point when there was a decision made that we need to sort of tap into other ways, other illicit schemes to raise finance. Because, as I started out saying, they can't just sort of go out into the global economy and try and raise money normally.
I mean, it's actually, I was over there in the Lebanon, and the Hezbollah, like, they actually are effectively a government of a large section of the country, aren't they? Like, because remember being in Beirut, and I was there with an aid organization, and they drive you out a bit and they say, now you're in the Hezbollah territory. Like, so they obviously need to generate a huge amount of money because they're running, social services effectively as well.
Massive. Yeah, that's a really, really important point. I mean, especially also there was a very, very significant step change in what they were doing with their entrance into the Syrian civil war, which is the sort of the moment in my book, Chasing Shadows, which is sort of about this stuff. That's kind of around that time when Hezbollah entered into the Syrian civil war, which was very, very different from what they were doing before. So, before they were sort of staging operations against Israel in the south, and then suddenly they're sort of entering into this sort of extremely intense urban kind of conflict where they are taking large casualties, they require a lot of weapons, they require sort of resources and strategies that they weren't used to using before, fighting in terrain or contexts that they hadn't previously really fought in. And that requires a lot of money. And they also took quite a large amount of casualties. And all of those casualties you have to sort of provide for widows and families. And, there are massive associated costs with that. So as you say, that's a really important point, that it's just extremely expensive if you're running a sort of effectively a state within a state. You have massive financial liabilities. But it all comes back to this sort of to what extent is this centralized? Obviously, the leadership of that organization, they have repeatedly said they have no involvement at all in crime or illicit activities, and this is sort of black propaganda put forward by their enemies. Yet the evidence over time has become significant that there are at least senior officials who are connected to this sort of activity, as has been disclosed by the US Department of Treasury. And
I think maybe all three of us are in agreement that Hezbollah has somewhat been involved in money laundering. They do control certain territories that, drug transport routes. They must have made a serious amount of money over the last 20 years, which has been a boom period for cocaine. So if we're looking at them getting some sort of a percentage, I mean, I have a calculator here now, which helps me add 2 and 2. You guys might be more into your mathematics of it. But even if they had managed to hone a small percentage of what has been made over the past 20 years from the cocaine industry, it is absolutely mind-boggling how much money they could have brought into the organization.
Yeah, I mean, also it's sort of there've been absolutely. I mean, it's a large amount of money, of course, and I mean, as you said, the sort of the explosion in the European cocaine industry has sort of coincided. It's created a need. The bigger it gets, the more really large scale drug traffickers and people who have sort of work more in collaboration with others and sort of they might sort of share supply lines, they might share money laundering strategies. They need liquidity, and sort of in a market, you need a liquid market for money laundering. If you're trying to move serious amounts of cash, you need a reliable counterparty who can move, hundreds of millions, not just sort of 5 million, 10 million here or there. And so it creates this whole sort of separate supply of a sort of service providers who can do this. I mean, I've spoken to officials who said that the price for money laundering in Europe has sort of gone down significantly. In a sense, there's so much to meet that demand. Previously services which would maybe take 20% of your money, some of them are down to 5%. Some people are even offering 0 because they actually want to create a liquid market. It's almost sort of like an incentive bonus for customers to sort of get them to, the more customers you have, the more liquidity you have, and the greater sort of the global network of exchanges you can have.
And are they then tied into the legitimate banking sector in the Lebanon? Because of course the Lebanon, it certainly 20, 30 years ago was the center of banking really in that part of the world, and it's still a very developed part of the economy, even though I know it's gone through a lot of struggles in recent times.
I mean, it's interesting. It's an interesting point. I mean, because what you saw, there's sort of, really interesting studies showing sort of the deposit growth in the Lebanese banking system from around 2006, where a large amount of money from abroad was coming in. And there were sort of these questions as to what were the origins of these funds. And as you've sort of mentioned, that more recently, there's been this huge financial crisis in the country. It's really suffered terribly. The central banker of Lebanon, who was once sort of this revered individual, as this sort of maestro, has sort of, been involved in huge scandals. And they've actually previously, there's been multiple US cases involving Lebanese banks. And so then it kind of gets into this other issue of like, what are the sort of broader macroeconomic factors of just like, if you have a sort of structural necessity to bring in deposits into your banking system, and where the origins of those money is coming from. I mean, you've had these really elaborate schemes. There was this case of a bank about a decade ago where it was taking a huge amount of cash, which was originating from the sale of used cars in West Africa. And, those used cars were being bought in places like the United States in cash, then sent on, boats to West Africa, then being sold, and then the money being put into Lebanese banks. And the DEA actually sort of uncovered that this was a very elaborate money laundering scheme being used by drugs traffickers. So it gets sort of extremely, extremely complicated, but it's all sort of plays into this these sort of like both macroeconomic factors and sort of on the ground political factors.
So is it all going to change now because of the conflict in Gaza? I mean, obviously the Hezbollah have maybe stood a bit off the getting involved in the conflict in recent times, but it's certainly going to bring a lot of attention on.
It's been kind of all eyes on them really to see what they're going to do, of course, because, you know, were they going to, there was a couple of rocket launches into Israel at the same time as the problems in Gaza were increasing, but they don't seem to have moved quickly, even though the messages from the leaders have been that, you know, they're watching, and the longer this goes on, the more likely it is for them to join forces as such with Hamas and go to war themselves.
Well, I mean, I think in general terms, I think we can say that, you know, the state of Lebanon right now is, you know, faces some very serious problems, and it is a far from optimal time for, you know, there to be a war. So there's a sort of difficult balancing act, I think, between obviously the sort of the main reasons for the existence of Hezbollah is to fight against Israel. So it has to be seen to be sort of doing something, but at the same time, the consequences, if there was a repeat of what happened in 2006, it would be a sort of a disaster. And, you know, so I think it's a very delicate balancing act. There's a lot of saber rattling. Who knows? We will see. But it's just this sort of like complicated, ever-changing situation. You know, the Middle East is a very complicated place for everyone to try and understand, even a little bit.
And even to comment on, like, because you don't want to go outside your realms of understanding of what's going on because of the sensitivities of it. But I mean, it was really just to know how wealthy is Hezbollah as an organization, I suppose, and if anything should tip over, that if they should decide to, you know, I suppose in a more powerful way, back what's happening with Hamas, what is the world facing? How much money could they possibly have in their war chests?
I mean, I think it's we could sort of invert that by saying, you know, arguably you can make an argument to say that the involvement in criminal schemes by any sort of state or pseudo-state sort of organization is also kind of potentially like a sign of weakness in a way. You know, like the leadership of Hezbollah has said frequently, you know, we get our money from Iran, like we don't need to get money from elsewhere. But obviously the reality of any complex organization is that there will be lots of people doing different things for different reasons. And so sort of back to that issue of how you separate, you know, the sort of how hierarchical, we know it's an extremely disciplined and trained organization. You know, it's sort of a paramilitary, you know, sort of style organization, is highly disciplined. So you would expect there to be a fairly tight sort of chain of command, and people would be aware of things people were doing, or at least tolerating them. But it would be that the sort of involvement in money laundering schemes and things like this could be seen actually as a sign of weakness. You know, really, sort of it's a sort of desperation. It's an element of having to take more risks or do things which are unappetizing. I mean, the case of money laundering, though, in general, especially drugs money laundering, is that, you know, it happens almost in every single case. You know, that where the defense will say, we never knew it was money from drugs. We were, you know, so a lot of these services, you had these cases, you know, important DEA cases over the last sort of, you know, 6-7 years, where there were money launderers operating in Europe who were connected to, according to the US government, very senior people in Hezbollah, you know, like top Hezbollah financiers who are sanctioned by the US government for being, you know, really the money men for the organization. They were in contact daily with people who were convicted in Europe for laundering large amounts of cocaine money for, you know, European drugs gangs, basically picking up money all across Europe. You know, they had a service. You know, you called up a number and you said, I'm in Antwerp, I've got 15 million euros, like, please launder it for me, take it to X or Y or whatever. Or, you know, they were going to Spain, Italy, you know, Holland, France, Germany. They would just send people in cars And, that often the money would be hidden in cars, and then they would, through various means, launder that money. But these were people who were later revealed in criminal cases, which was tried in front of a court, to be in daily contact with some of the top people in Hezbollah. So that stuff is real. But at the same time, when you're a money launderer, you'll just say, I didn't know the money was from drugs. I'm a money broker. I provide money broking services. Someone drops off cash to me and I exchange it through an exchange house in Beirut and give them the money somewhere else. And I had no idea. And that's generally what happens in these things. So there's a less stigma attached to, compared to actually trafficking in loads of cocaine. You're trafficking in money. Yes, it's dirty money, but there's a plausible deniability there where you can say, we're just moving the money.
Yeah, you can stay a few steps away from it. Isn't it interesting? And maybe it all concentrates the mind on something that myself and Niall talk about quite a lot, which is the demand for cocaine and where that money goes ultimately, that's handed over in a nightclub in the flash of a hand on a street, €100 bag. And where does that €100 go? It goes all the way up the lines into the likes of the hands of, some of it into the hands of terrorists who are, reaping havoc across the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just this sort of strange sort of shadow economy, this sort of parallel universe where, unlikely characters, have to sort of interact, these sort of complex, these sort of weird cases where, for example, they found, this massive, I think it was in 2021, if I'm correct, there was this huge seizure of Captagon pills in Naples, in the port in Naples. It was millions and millions of these Captagon pills, which, as widely sort of documented, are made in Syria, by, government. So, how does that end up in a port in Naples? Who are the local partners there? How would they get into contact with each other? It's sort of this strange, very unlikely alliances. And I think you see that just more and more in...
And on the ground, like in Italy, is that where the market was? Or who is taking those?
No, because as far as I'm aware, that's not a drug which is taken by people in Italy. The market for that is very much in the Gulf. It's quite popular in Gulf countries. And so why it was being sent, I think there were some theories that it was being sent to Libya or something, but why it was being sent that way, I don't know. But it just shows that there are these really bizarre sort of supply chains and sort of business networks which involve extremely unlikely bedfellows, people who would just have nothing really to do with each other normally. And it's sort of because they're operating in, it's like a sort of shadow marketplace where they're service providers. So I think the important thing here is just the idea, at least from my conversations with people who are close to these sorts of things, the ideological component often is less really important than sometimes it's given credit for, in the sense of just a lot of these people, even people who are relatively close to the organizations, sort of prescribed terrorist organizations and stuff, they just so often seem to be acting basically out of pure financial self-interest.
It's so familiar, isn't it?
It is. I mean, unfortunately for our regular drug dealers, they tend to draw the attention of the American government because they're dealing with Hezbollah, who may not have been bothered with them otherwise. I think that might be a miscalculation on their behalf.
Yeah, I mean, no, really, absolutely, completely. I actually was thinking about that recently. It's just, you can get into these situations where you don't know who you're dealing with necessarily, or, that person might be really good at laundering your money, but then the upshot of that, as you say, is that you attract serious law enforcement attention.
For sure. Miles, thanks a million for coming on again. And no doubt we'll be talking in the near future as hopefully no situation with Hezbollah continues, but as your own investigations into international money laundering and all the links does.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me on. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks, Miles.
I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.